So good morning, or lunchtime, and thank you for being in this session with us. So I hope this will be, this is part of my PhD work, and I hope this will be light enough as the last talk of the session. I will present a case study analysis of the effects of using participatory evaluation within an already existing evaluation framework, and this work has been conducted with the advice from Chris Frauenberger, Geraldine, Fitzpatrick, and Eva Hornecker. So we have previously presented both approaches individually and independently, one following the other, but we had never illustrated how they work in combination or what exactly would change when evaluation is also participatory. And if there is one thing that you take away from the session, then I wish this could be, there are these approaches to critically assess experience with a strong participatory component, and they might be valuable for your analysis. If you take that with and then look up the work again, or hedge me up, take that with. So, the context of the work was the Outside the Box project, in which we co-created technologies for the holistic well-being of a cohort of individual autistic children. We developed a range of ubiquitous technologies that were guided by the children's interests instead of an extrinsic measure of what they might need. And please also note, I use identity-first language as is common within the self-representation of disabled people, particularly the autistic community. So what is co-design? First, for those who have never heard of that, or participatory design, I do conflate the terms here. There have slight differences, but I'm not going into that right now. I just like mentioning that. But it was important to us to involve autistic children directly in the design process so they could have some agency over what is developed, but also so that they could let their individual expertise come into the process. So, we know how it is to be a researcher. We know how to navigate our space. We know how to be adults, but they know how to be autistic children and what that feels like and what that means and what they need to be happy in that space. So they were involved in we identified 4 parts of designs, parts of the design process. So that will be, we involved them in ideation, conceptualization, prototyping, and testing. So there are 2 parts, as I said, to the methodological procedure. Critical experience frames our analysis of experience, whereas participatory evaluation is our approach to understand specifically the children's perspective with a strong participatory component to what it means to interact with that technology. So there are 4 steps. This is super quick, it's super dense, but as I said, please look up the work. I did not know how to say that otherwise, but there are 4 steps to critical experience that are repeated until saturation is reached, your casual qualitative approach. So you define the context of an experience, after which data is gathered to populate actors. This will make more sense in a second. And the relationship in a network, and that data is analyzed and put into statements, which are then again contextualized within networks. So I use actor network theory, and I have data visualization. Do not try to read all this. This is more to illustrate the complexity of what is happening when we try and assess the experiences autistic children have with technologies that we co-designed. There are a lot of people and concepts and places and things at stake that are relevant to understand that experience. And this is a starting point from which people could start in our project to analyze then the individual cases. And we had, and different analysis processes might look slightly different, but there are these core actors which are comprised of the children, the technology, and the researchers, and each require kind of different mode of data analysis or data gathering. So in applying this, we found a gap in trying to assess the experiences of autistic children from their first-person perspective. And just let me add, that is not a surprising gap as such, seeing as most technologies in that space are developed with an extrinsic measure of trying to alter the child or alter the child's behavior, and that was not our approach. But if there is an extrinsic measure, you might not be interested in how the child feels, you might be interested how the child changes. In our case, we were interested how the child experiences the technology because it was just for a different use case. That is no judgment, that is just the angle was just fundamentally different from what is common in the field. So, because we lack that, it's okay. Because we lack that, and you can see more in our previous Kai paper about that, we developed participatory approach to evaluate these technologies. If you want to know more about that, I see Judith is also here, who is a co-author on that paper. And in that process, we let children take the lead in different steps of evaluation. We were setting goals together that were meaningful to the children and not defined by the researchers. We were gathering data together along modes that were relevant to them. So if you had, there will be examples in a sec. And then we were interpreting the results together so that we could, so that it would make sense to the children as well. So that does not mean researchers cannot do their own part of evaluation and follow their own questions. It just means there is an additional process where the children define what the relevant questions are for a technology and have agency in the process of creating meaning about this technology and their experiences with it. Okay. Let's get into cases. So we used them both in a range of case studies within the Outside the Box project. As I said, in total there were eight different projects with individual children, and we had 8 different technologies that were the result of that. This is just they had. On top you see the name of the technology, often also co-defined, and underneath this just the name that we give them in our publications. And there, you can see, it ranged from very different things. The Adaja on top is a sound lens which illustrates how loud the environment is, with which you can just explore the environment differently. On the bottom to the right, there is a time machine, which is more or less a narrative environment that allows children to have shared experiences instead of what we had seen before was that there was a child who was really into space and time and explaining to people how planets are and what how they came to be and how the Earth was before it was like this. But it was this one-sided lecture, and the time machine allowed them to be do that together and have this embedded in a narrative where that special knowledge and this hyper focus was shared in a way that the other children could participate. But just as an illustration of what kinds of technologies came out there and what the range might be. There is also one, I should mention that. There is one, the thinking machine, ThinkM, is one that has had a super success with when we present the project to educators, because it's a reflection machine. It takes photos of your daily life together with your heartbeat, and then you can analyze how you felt in certain situations according to your biometric signals. That was, by the way, an invention of a 6-year-old at the time who strongly identified as a scientist, and we were we did an okay job in creating the thing, but it's really his. We have talked about a few designs at other places. You can probably just look them up. They're also cited in the paper because, and then I will focus on these 3 cases individually now here to show what happened. In the first 4, we used only critical experiences. In the second 4, we used participatory evaluation as well, and how we can see that by analyzing it through, you remember the giant diagram? Having that kind of approach with participatory evaluation where we didn't have that before. Okay. So what you see here is Quentin's, or a snapshot of Quentin's network. And Quentin was actually an interesting case because he refused to participatory evaluate with us. And that was great, actually, because through that refusal, we also learned that there was no interest in what others might think about this, or there was no interest in communicating their particular interest of, like, what this means to them. It was theirs, and they also constantly changed it. Like, they are sound boxes, but they only looked like that for, like, maybe a week, and that was a tinkering child. That he took them apart and reframed them and refocused them and added things from his home, crafting things, tools, other things. It was constant flux. It was never one technology, and at some point, like, the components broke apart and it's not existing anymore. But that child wanted from that technology something entirely different than we would have even thought when we made it. And we kind of can see that in the process by seeing how these daily routine, not the daily, we can see that in process by, down here, that's better. You see down there that there are like these different elements that play such a huge role, and you see how many of these elements play a huge role. And if you zoom into the network, you can see how that is much more pronounced here than we had that previously, and that gave an indication through, like, understanding the refusal. But it also tells us methodologically that through the refusal we can learn about the experience in terms of, like, how it should be shared and how it should be meaningful. Like, sometimes it's just for you, and sometimes it's just like your own thing, and you don't actually care. You don't actually care what others think. And I think in participatory design that there should be space for that as well. This is a data gathering method. Just like that first one was for setting goals, this is for gathering data. We noticed that we had suddenly different ways to inquire the children's perspectives. What you can see is a drawing that has a childish style of two stick figures under a starry sky. Remember the time machine? That's from that technology. Under a starry sky with technological objects in between. I cut it out for to make it look artsy. So what we can see here is how different things are of different importance. One of the children is larger than the other. That's the brother who was not involved in the design. They had their initials set there. That's the smudged bit. They had their initials set there, so we know who is who. But, like, the brother who was not involved in the design, but very much in the play afterwards, was smaller than the child who created it. And what the child there wanted to know is how the brother can be involved and is involved and is part of that and sees himself. And it was, like, very interesting to see how it through that drawing, because they kind of conveyed their position to each other. That's fine. And then seeing how, like, we create statements from different data. We also understood through that participatory process that statements don't have to be words. Let me focus on that. Statements don't have to be words. They can sometimes just be a smiley that is drawn all over the place at different components of the technology and of the evaluation schemes. Even if you co-design them, if you co-design the evaluation, it doesn't mean that participants follow the script that they brought in previously, but that's okay. So we had just a quick note on our insights. We learned different things about the experiences of the children and methodologically to go further for both participatory evaluation and critical experience. For Quentin, it was kind of like focused on the final object in terms of, like, having a final object that becomes a final object all over the time, like that was in flux. Ivan and Hank had this mediated engagement through where they had different experiences through that carpet that allowed them to have a shared play experience instead of a one-sided lecture. And Oliver had this achievement in the design process where he had incredible ownership on that. And methodologically, we learned that limited data can still yield insights, and refusal is part of the process. With Ivan and Hank, those as brothers, they had, like, their own kind of hierarchies and struggles, and we learned how careful negotiation is important when you have differing needs present. And differing needs can also, by the way, change like just within the same person through a temporal dimension. People feel different from time to time. I can say that easier. And with Oliver, we learned that statements can go beyond like written word language. So yeah, thank you. Go forth, use this. I am available. Let me know that. I will help you do that. I will help you find out the ways if you want to use these things. And just to remember, there are these approaches to critically assess experience with a strong participatory component, and they might be valuable for your analysis as well.
Hi, thank you very much for your interesting and important work. I have actually two questions. The first one, I'm sure I haven't read the paper, and I'm sure you considered ethic.
I have a paper on that.
Okay. So I was wondering, in terms of the methodology, I'm not familiar with autistic on the spectrum, so I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit of how you chose the autistic children, what parameters led you to decide who participate in the project. And the other question is whether you had any outcomes or understanding that are autistic specific in terms of, or whether it can apply to a larger audience. So essentially, can we apply whatever you learned from your study to the overall general population?
So yeah, shameless plug. I had a paper at PDC about the microethics in participatory design with marginalized children, if you want to look into that. That particularly go into the judgments of the minutiae of doing the work. Regarding the participants, we chose them. There is a program in Vienna where the work was conducted, where there is a mentorship program from the city for autistic children who are in mainstream schooling. Are like these mentors like navigate between therapeutic institutes, parents, schools, and all these institutions that are there. So through making contact there initially, and then within the schools, we just like had it was kind of a little bit of also word of mouth, right? Like we got some suggested there. Others found us. Then in one classroom, there was like this teacher who was like, "Well, this really privileged child who had parents who were really into that and like got their kid into the program. That's really great. But we have this other child that does not have such a privileged background that is also autistic. Don't you want to consider that?" So as well, like it was like kind of like a convenience as well. But I think that's okay in that context. Autism specific, I'm not actually sure. I always felt like I did the work with autistic children, but that it could go further, and I'm actually investigating that at the moment. So, yeah, I would make the argument that this is like... Is this me? I don't know. I would make the argument that the work is relevant whenever we lack a little bit of, not lack empathy, but like whenever empathetic approaches fall short because our life experiences are different. So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your great presentation. I'm Vivian Motti from George Mason University. I appreciate a lot this approach of bringing the children as main authors of the design process. But do you think the technologies that they proposed could be used by instructors or therapists in their own work? Like, have you assessed the solutions with them?
We did not. That was just like not part of what we did. If I may speculate, I think some and others not. Like one of the technologies we developed was an alarm clock that a huge audience found interesting because it made you... the child was really into Mario games, and the melody that is played as waking up is like the Super Mario. No, that's Tetris. Sorry, but it was that melody. It's not coming to me right now. And to shut it up, you had to step out of the bed and step on a mat, and you had to actually get up. And a lot of people find that appealing for some reason. So it just depends on what the technology is, but I think some of them, like the reflection thing, as I said, when we had to present the work in front of educators, they were like always like, ooh, I know a few people who that would be interested in, and I would like to use that or whatever. So, yeah.
I just want to ask something small. I really enjoyed this. This is absolutely amazing. And I wanted to know, I know that they're very young kids, but did the process give them tools? You already know my question, so...
Oh, ask it.
Okay. So did the process give them tools beyond just designing, like how to have a project, how to word their needs and what they want?
I just love this question because it lets me tell my favorite story that has nothing to do with my scientific work as such, and I can never like publish that or like get any credit for that, but it's like the most impactful thing I did in that process. So there's one child who, that's actually with the alarm clock. And she was really into drawing, but she also had difficulties communicating her needs somewhat. And what we did with her as a data gathering method, just like where that fits into the process, was that we created a magazine. There was an advert for the technology that showed us like how she saw it and what she saw and the benefits. But she also went and interviewed the project leader, who was not in the sessions necessarily, and her mother on that, and she wrote a review, and like it was like a whole thing. And then we learned half a year later, just when we had like a checkup, how it's going, and we also had to repair it. When we have to repair things, that's the best thing because that means they're used. So we had a checkup, and she brought with her 4 comic books that explained how she works, or how her inner workings are. And she started writing comic books with a superhero who is autistic, and explains her experiences in daily life. And it's just so amazing. Like, I don't know, like just having been part of like finding that for her is that's like the biggest credit I've ever had.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks.